Our next guest was the lead consultant in a multidisciplinary group that developed the inner city housing implementation plan that you heard referenced in our last interview, as well as the inner city roadmap for the city of Johannesburg. She has co-authored a bad building strategy for the city and has worked extensively on informality, migration and property transformation in the inner city. Again, all convergent themes in the inner city right now. Dr. Tanya Zack, thank you very much for joining us tonight and welcome to Full View. So we heard a hint there about the strategy. What happened to the plan? What happened to the strategy?
Well, the strategy was approved by the mayoral committee and it has not been fully funded. It has not been given the resources that it needs, either from the city or from national government. And I think the city gets distracted into other issues and doesn't retain its focus on pro-poor development and pro-poor housing.
Well, let's go to the funding issue. Do you know why it wasn't funded?
I think we have. I can't say why it wasn't funded inside, inside of the city, but the city does require creative funding also from national government. Presently, our housing for the very poor focuses mainly on RDP housing and on ownership, and we haven't got a rental subsidy for the very poor, which is required and which has been on the debating table since the beginning of the post-apartheid regime. So that is a major issue. But secondly, the city has been forced to the table in terms of its development of emergency accommodation or of housing for the very poor in the inner city. It's done it under duress when it's been forced to do so by the Constitutional Court. And we actually have to be more agile. We have to be focused on providing both the funding but also the instruments for other actors to come into the party. Where there are small-scale developers, where there are larger developers who are able to do this, the city isn't fast-tracking those programs and isn't opening up the field for many actors to be involved in this. There are innovative answers within the city. There are innovative answers with rooms for rent, backyarding, etc. It's possible to densify our near inner city suburbs with very creative programs that would not only deliver housing, but also deliver jobs, also deliver artisanal training. Because ultimately, the problem of housing is a problem of poverty, is a problem of unemployment. And we need to be tackling it in that multi-perspective of the crises of poverty of the poor.
Tanya, as I listen to you, and it's not new to my ears because I've been watching what you've written and what you've said on the subject, it sounds like there is such an incredible opportunity, multi-dimensional opportunity in big and small initiatives that the city can embark on to really deal with the problem credibly and to provide those safe spaces within the budgets of those who are most exposed and most vulnerable, which makes what you said earlier just even more stark. Where is the political will to drive it, to make sure that the money is there so that this can happen? You've touched on some of those interventions and thank you for doing so. I think it's worth sharing with our viewers the extent of the housing issue as it affects the poorest who live in the inner city who need cheap and safe housing.
So it is a vast need, and our emphasis on providing housing for the poor on the periphery means that we're not restructuring the apartheid city form, and the poor are doing it for themselves, are moving into spaces in the inner city where the only accommodation is in overcrowded spaces delivered informally. It's not just, Iman, that we have a crisis of unemployment, but we also have these incredible barriers to entry. So if you're a migrant, if you're an asylum seeker, for example, and you have money to invest in housing or to put into rental, you cannot do that because your asylum seeking papers are only valid for 6 months. You can't sign a year's lease. So, and you cannot open a bank account. If you are an informal trader, you're not enabled to sign a lease in a formal building. And so the only options available are these options in overcrowded spaces or in spaces where the poor are housing one another in these spaces. I don't have to hand the exact statistics of the size of the problem in the inner city, but it is vast. We counted if you looked at the census, there were 300% more households than there was physical accommodation available when we did the ARCH study.
Tanya, as you know, as always, I wish we could have just had an exclusive, sort of 1 hour on this, because it would cover that. I was going to ask you about the finger pointing and politicking. Doesn't seem quite as relevant now. We've heard enough on that. But talk to us about what are the opportunities to reanimate what we've already heard is a credible plan to prevent this potentially from happening again, and to be really fully immersed in the world of those who are at the fringes of housing and who don't have it.
So the city needs to elevate planning. I think that's important, and the country needs to elevate planning. And what that partially means is that, we've got a lot of land, we have a lot of state-owned buildings, we have land that is held by PRASA, by state-owned entities, who are not subject to the local planning of Johannesburg or of other metros, and that needs to change. That the plans that the city puts out, that other state entities need to be subject to. So that is one thing. We need to provide emergency services in those buildings, and that can be done. And then we need to do a rollout of rehabilitating. There are many buildings which are at high risk, but it is possible to rehabilitate them, and we need to move onto those. We need to create partnerships with the private sector who can develop faster than the city can, to incentivize those. We need to create density incentives. We need to create incentives for small-scale landlords to undertake, increased densities on the fringe of the inner city. We have low-rise development, and we can do a vast number of developments. We need to tackle the sectional title issue, which is behind the bad buildings in the city, and which the city has the regulation to tackle.
All right, Tanya, that's all the time we have for this segment, but definitely subjects that we can pick up on. And as you say, all we need is a little creativity, some lateral thinking, and some honest to goodness governance. Thank you for talking to us tonight. We appreciate you, Dr. Tanya Zack.